Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Dave was the love of her life. They had met cute in New York. After initially ignoring him, she gave in and both fell fast. They soon moved in together and planned a wedding for October 2001, but on a whim had flown to Hawaii for a few days in August, where Dave surprised her with an impromptu wedding that was witnessed by men who escorted her, barefoot, onto the sand to stand next to Dave.
And there were these 4 huge Hawaiian warriors with torches waiting for me outside, and I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, no, we're just escorting you down the garden. I'm like, okay. So I followed them and we went all the way to the beach. And there was Dave standing in the middle of a circle of orchids. And the next morning, we started calling all our friends and families, telling them we had gotten married. Not married, but married.
Now, despite this wedding being overseen by a quote-unquote official-looking man, Dave's betrothed told some folks that the ceremony had been too impromptu to likely be legal, so the October date still held. Then, on September 11th, 2001, barely a month after the glorious beach ceremony, Tanya Head said she was on the 96th floor of the World Trade Center's South Tower, getting ready for her 9 a.m. meeting with Merrill Lynch colleagues. At 8:46 a.m., the tower shook. Lights briefly flickered, and Tanya, a take-charge kind of gal, told everyone she would check to see what happened. We all would know soon enough what happened. An American Airlines flight from Boston to Los Angeles, fully loaded with jet fuel and carrying 92 people on board, piloted by al-Qaeda terrorists, most of them Saudi nationals, had been deliberately flown into the North Tower, and the worst and longest day anyone alive could remember began to unfold. Tanya looked out a window, counting down to find which floors were burning. Each tower had 110 floors, and she saw that the plane or bomb or whatever it was had breached the 92nd to the 99th. The fire and black smoke were already bellowing out the sides of the massive structure. She could already see people standing on the edges of windows, preparing to jump to their deaths. She knew that her beloved Dave was at work on the 99th floor, but maybe he had gone down for coffee. He had called and asked her to join him just a few minutes before, but she'd been too concerned about her meeting to take the time. Maybe he was already out on the street. She had to go see, but not before telling her colleagues to follow her down. Her assistant, a young and frightened woman named Christine, seemed at first to be the only one who took her advice. The 2 women got to the elevator to get to the sky lobby on the 78th floor, where they would grab an express elevator to the ground floor. There was a wait for the first elevator, and then on the 78th, a much longer wait. People were cordial but nervous. It was just a little past 9:02 to be exact, when everyone waiting could hear another jet coming straight for them. Tanya Head regained consciousness to find herself in the middle of an inferno of twisted metal and glass, nearly everyone around her dead. Some she knew. Maybe they had followed her. She found Christine. Her body was still. Her head was somewhere else. Tanya Head's story of survival and loss would become one of the most compelling accounts to emerge from September 11th. For years, she would tell it over and over to support groups, to visiting dignitaries, to tour groups at Ground Zero. She became the president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network and the face of those who escaped that day. But in 2007, when reporters began asking routine questions to verify details for an anniversary story, Tanya Head stopped answering her phone. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Hims. You know those little things in life that seem impossible? Like folding a fitted sheet.
Nobody knows how to do that.
Hims can't help you fold a fitted sheet, but it can help with your performance in bed.
And that's because erectile dysfunction is actually really common, even though a lot of guys don't love talking about
The
it.
good news is that getting help is simpler than it used to be. Through Hims, you can access personalized prescription treatment options for ED if prescribed, all online.
So instead of scheduling awkward appointments or sitting in a waiting room, you can connect online with a licensed provider.
And Hims offers access to ED treatment options ranging from personalized products to trusted generics that cost 95% less than brand names if prescribed.
It's basically expert care brought straight to you.
Exactly. Hims puts your health and goals first with real medical providers helping make sure you get the treatment that works for you.
To get simple online access to personalized, affordable care for ED, hair loss, weight loss, and more, visit hims.com/COTC. That's hims.com/COTC for your free online visit. hims.com/COTC.
Featured products include compounded drug products, which the FDA does not approve or verify for safety, effectiveness, or quality. Prescription required. See website for details, restrictions, and important safety information. Actual price will depend on product and subscription plan. There are a lot of ways to hurt people. There are a lot of reasons why we hurt people. Most are forgivable, some are not. As with criminal actions, intent matters. It will always matter that on September 11th, 2001, 2 freshly fueled jets were purposefully flown into 2 of the most iconic American structures, killing 2,753 passengers, office workers, and emergency responders. That, and 2 other similarly committed acts perpetrated by men who use domestic aircraft as missiles, remains the most lethal terrorist attack in history. All told, nearly 3,000 people died that day, and thousands more were injured. We can never know what they lived to witness or died seeing, but we can guess and be rightly horrified. Tanya Head said she immediately realized she was gravely hurt. Her right arm felt as if it was severed from the rest of her body, but she had bigger worries. So she tucked her right hand into her Armani jacket pocket, and the arm seemed to follow. She thought about Dave, about death, his and hers. Out of nowhere, a man with a red bandana tied around his face somehow found her and got her to a stairway. He told her to keep moving. On her way down, she saw a dying man who reached out to give her his wedding ring and asked her to give it to his wife. She took it and saw that he was dead before she could even make the promise. Somewhere on the flights down, Tanya faltered, only to be picked up and carried by a New York firefighter the rest of the way. She was about to be put into an ambulance when the South Tower fell, and again, she had the good fortune to be in the company of heroes. This time, a firefighter threw her under a truck, covered her body, and gave her oxygen. The 2 waited as hundreds of thousands of pounds of dust and debris rained down. She awoke 5 days later in the hospital, asking about Dave. Her mother and father had arrived from their home in Spain. Days passed before her mother finally told her that Dave had perished. When she was sent home, her right arm had been reattached, yet the burns remained. She was alive, but felt that life had no meaning. She left the apartment and the life she had had with Dave behind, taking only their dog, Elvis, with her. Therapists told her to give it time. She would return to the living when she was ready. That happened in the late spring of 2003, when Tanya decided to reach out to others like herself to see if they could heal together. A quick Google search pulled her an online support group of those who had been inside the tower that day and had gotten out. At first, she was cautious, and the details she shared were scarce. Her first entry, quote, "I think I need to talk to someone about this and tell my story, but I don't see how I will manage to do that. Going through it once was more than enough. God bless, Tanya," end quote. She soon discovered that, like her, other survivors felt as if no one cared about them. In the words of survivor Angelo Guglielmo Jr., the families were, quote, at the top of the hierarchy of grief, end quote. But the survivors felt they had no voice in the memorial work that was being done. No one was asking their opinions. No one seemed to want to hear their stories. Brandon Chellis had just reached the front entrance of the North Tower when the first plane hit. He was in the lobby when fire blasted down the elevator shafts, forcing the cars to drop and spew fire and bodies on those below. Brendan had helped to start a survivors forum in the summer of 2002 with Jerry Bogach, who had been on the 82nd floor of the North Tower. The two reached out to others like them. Brendan wrote, quote, "We continue to be tortured by that day, yet it seems that nobody, even the people who are supposed to help us, understand what we are going through. We watched thousands of people just like us die. We knew it was just a matter of chance, that it was them and not us," end quote. Even though they were ostensibly part of the World Trade Center United Families group, they felt they suffered in obscurity. They weren't wrong. On the second anniversary of the attack, when the survivors showed up for the ceremony, an invitation-only affair for the families, the politicians, the fire department, they were not given credentials to attend. A month later, Tanya Head suggested they should fix that. Tanya had great people skills. She also had good organizational skills and wasn't afraid to ask for and get access to the right people. While she learned that others shared her guilt and her regret and her nightmares, she felt like she could finally talk about her own harrowing escape and the horror of learning that Dave had not survived. How she was one of the last out of the South Tower. How she had almost lost her arm. Up until now, she had done all her telling by simply posting her story. Everyone who read the blog knew that hers was the most harrowing story they had heard. It was genuinely an impossible tale of courage and luck. Angelo, who later wrote about her, said that everyone in the group was anxious to meet her in the flesh. He wrote, quote, "Of course, the anticipation of her arrival had been spine-tingling. It was all any of them could talk about for days before. In the few short weeks since she's posted her amazing account of bravery and heartbreak online, Tanya had become a legend in the awakening survivor community. She was the Uber survivor. So when she walked into the meeting, it felt to the other 24 or so men and women there as if a celebrity had entered the room," end quote. It was January 24th, 2004, and the group was now set to break away from the larger 9/11 family support group and give themselves a distinctive name and mission. Tanya's entrance would be the turning point for the group. They had yearned to be allowed to return to ground zero, to be allowed past the chain link fence, privately, to process it all and grieve. No one had allowed that. It took Tanya only 6 weeks to arrange the visit. She had proven that she, and the survivors she represented, had the moral high ground here. They had a right to be there. It was as if they were those sailors who survived Pearl Harbor. They'd been the first to feel the wrath of those who hated this country. When the day arrived, each of the survivors arrived with their own thoughts. The cleanup was, more or less, complete. They walked down into a cavernous hole where the towers had fallen onto so many, obliterating whatever was above, below, and around them. In the months and years to follow, Bogach found Tanya willing to give money and time, even time away from her work at Merrill Lynch, to support the group's efforts and, more importantly, to help those who had lost loved ones that day. She knew their pain. Even so, she appeared to be upbeat, vibrant, optimistic. Most read that as her own way of pushing forward. They knew her pain as well. Live for something other than the pain, she would say. She made it sound possible. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Ollie. You know how people say their dog is part of the family?
People say that, but with us, it's not really a metaphor.
No, our dogs are absolutely family members. And when you care that much about your dog, you pay close attention to what they're eating. That's one reason I like Ollie. Their fresh dog food recipes are developed by real chefs and backed by vet nutritionists using high-quality ingredients.
And everything is tailored to your dog.
Right. When you sign up, you tell them about your dog, and they build a plan with perfectly portioned meals. It arrives with this pup-tainer and scoops, so it's easy to store and serve.
They also have an app where you can check on your dog's health, right?
Yes, you can actually upload a photo, and their vet team can check in on things like weight, digestion, teeth, and coat. It's a nice extra bit of peace of mind.
Get ready for both you and your pup to be obsessed. Head to ollie.com/COTC, tell them all about your dog, and use code COTC to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today.
Plus, they offer an obsession guarantee. If you're not completely obsessed, you'll get your money back.
That's OLLIE.com/COTC. Enter code COTC to get 60% off your first box.
Ollie, feed the obsession. Tanya's adherence to that motto, live for something other than the pain, explained a lot. She was now throwing herself into making the survivor cause upmost in the minds of those who mattered. Here's Angelo Guglielmo again. Quote, "There wasn't a day that passed when Tanya didn't propose some new initiative, some new way to ensure the network's relevance. Her mission was to get the survivors noticed, and she worked until her fingers blistered from punching the numbers on her phone and pounding the keys on her computer. She reached out to influence bureaucrats in the New York State Assembly and City Hall, to the movers and shakers in the 9/11 stratosphere, and to survivors groups from other disasters. Her emails to the other survivors arrived at all hours of the night, and they wondered when she slept. But it was largely due to these compulsive efforts that the survivors were gaining recognition and, at least to some degree, an identity within the cloistered 9/11 establishment." End quote. The group made her the co-chair of the World Trade Center Survivors Network, along with Bogach. She explained that she was back at Merrill Lynch and it might prove too much, but these were important times for WTC memorial planning. The WTC Visitor Center was now ready to open and looking for volunteers to speak to those who arrived daily to see, from a barricaded distance, the gaping hole in the ground. Tanya signed up. She had found a way to tell her story over and over, to cry anew at her loss, to remember Dave. She was good at it. So good that she was asked to accompany New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, New York Governor George Pataki, and financier Michael Bloomberg on a tour of the site as decisions were being made about what to do with the now historic ground. Around that same time, the Survivors Network heard that the Port Authority, they owned the site on which the towers had stood, wanted to demolish the only stairs that had survived the attack, the collapse, and the cleanup. The stairs were in the way of the planned rebuilding. Yeah, it was just 37 steps of steel and granite, but these stairs had once connected the outdoor plaza to the street below and had been part of the way out for survivors that day. If you visit the memorial site now, this is what a docent will tell you about the stairs.
If you were a person who had been in one of the buildings that morning when the attack began, and you successfully escaped with your life that day, you had to do three things. First, we all know those harrowing stories of the people walking down the stairs from wherever floor they were on, 80 floors, 70, 60, all the way down to the lobby. Well, once you got to the lobby, that wasn't the end of your escape, because you still had to get out of the building, you had to get across some part of the plaza, and then you had to get down to the street. Now, getting out of the building wasn't so easy as just opening a door. Many of the doors were jammed shut. The lobbies were full of falling debris. There were fires burning, there was smoke, there were pipes that had exploded and water that was spilling everywhere. So now you got out the door, and now you had the plaza to get across. Well, that was treacherous too. We know from the moment those planes hit the buildings, there was a steady stream of debris that was raining down on the open plaza. So any time that you spent out in the open on that plaza could potentially result in you losing your life. So you had to get across the open plaza as fast as possible, and then you had to get down to the street. This particular stairway, not only was it undercover, but the building itself that it was underneath, the building had an overhang on the plaza level. So as first responders were pointing people towards where this stair was located, and this is what we heard time and again from people who survived because of the stairs. People recount the first responders pointing them towards this building, number 5, and saying, get across that plaza as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't slow down, don't look back, don't look up. Just get across to that building.
To reiterate, you had to get to these stairs to get to the street. The survivors had gotten to these stairs. This was their sacred ground. They were not going to let it disappear. The network, under the direction of Tanya, launched a public campaign to save the stairs. A lot of people knew what stairs they were talking about. Countless pictures were taken after the attacks and before the collapses of survivors moving down those stairs before they got to VC Street to run like hell. The survivors politely asked the stairs be put in such a place as to allow them to come and be alone with their thoughts, and for the public to see what remained. As a small aside, the stairs are now located in a pretty prominent indoor space, which is adjacent to escalators that take site visitors to the vast array of other objects salvaged from that day. But back to late 2005, that's when the New York Times took notice of the network's campaign, sending reporter David Dunlap to write about it. The story ran on November 25th, 2005. In part, Dunlap wrote, quote, "The upper steps still have their crisp granite treads. The lower steps are craggy as a Roman antiquity. They convey a sense of human scale on the gigantically emptied landscape of Ground Zero," end quote. He quoted Patty Clark, a senior aviation advisor at the Port Authority, who escaped that day by way of that staircase. Quote, "It's religious, it's literary, it's all very much woven into how we explain things," end quote. Explaining things was what Tanya did best. To anyone who asked, to strangers she was guiding through the site, to officials, to reporters. She told about Dave's fairy tale marriage proposal and the memorable dinner they had shared at the Trade Center's Windows of the World restaurant. Sometimes her fellow survivors noticed that she called Dave her fiancé, and, strangely maybe, sometimes she called him her husband. She certainly considered herself a widow. She founded a subgroup of wives of those who had died that day. Inside the group, no one wanted to bring up inconsistencies in anyone's story, especially since Tanya's was filled with so much drama and pain. Linda Gormley's survivor story couldn't claim half the sympathy that Tanya's did, but Tanya didn't judge people by that standard. Linda had been standing outside the towers just after the planes hit and watched as people chose to escape out the windows, only to end up on the sidewalks. She had not seen everything, but she had seen plenty. Still, she was pretty amazed that Tanya, the group's superstar, was so approachable to the others. On September 6, 2004, Linda read about Tanya in Time magazine after writer Amanda Ripley did a piece on what the survivors were still facing 3 years after the attack. Ripley took pains to explain that something like 20,000 people had escaped the burning towers that day. In the story, Tanya said, quote, "People cannot understand. We saw things. We had to make life or death decisions. The higher the floor, the more lonely you were. I can't get rid of my fear that it's going to happen again," end quote. At the next survivors meeting, Tanya got a standing ovation for her frankness. That fall, both Tanya and Linda were part of a group that went to the Museum of Natural History for a scavenger hunt. The group thought that socializing normally, apart from the heaviness of their common connection, was helpful in building trust. Linda and Tanya were standing at the coat check when the attendant acted as if the group were celebrities. "That's so cool," she said when they confirmed that they had indeed escaped the towers that day. Then she added, "I wish I was." The two women were stunned. Then they laughed. They both assured the young woman she most certainly did not want to be them. Linda and Tanya bonded immediately. They would see each other through whatever came now. Here was a woman to whom Tanya could talk to about Dave all the time, about how they had wanted kids, how they had just bought a beach cottage in the Hamptons, what they ate at their favorite restaurants, what he said about their specialness, what his parents confided to her, how she had stayed in touch with them, how they all loved the beach house, how they were private people and didn't want to participate in any of the anniversary doings, but let her do it in their stead. How she and Dave's mom watched the video of the marriage over and over so they could cry together. Linda could talk about what she had seen, nothing more, nothing less. In this, and so much more, the two women could hold tight to one another. Hey everyone, before we get back to the show, just a reminder that you can get bonus episodes and bonus material at grabbagcollab.com. Just go to grabbagcollab.com and choose which tier you'd like to subscribe to. Thanks so much. At 24 years old, Wells Crowther was in his first year as an equities trader at the investment banking firm of Sandler, O'Neill and Partners. On September 11th, 2001, he was on the 104th floor of the South Tower. His body was recovered 6 months later, alongside those of New York Fire Department firefighters who had been operating a command center in the tower lobby. Crowther had been able to reach the lobby that day, but little was known by his family about what happened to him before the tower collapsed. It was not until a New York Times story appeared on March 26, 2002, that eyewitnesses told how a young man had saved them. In May 2014, President Obama told Wells' story at the dedication of the 9/11 memorial.
In those awful moments, after the South Tower was hit, some of the injured huddled in the wreckage of the 78th floor. Fires were spreading. The air was filled with smoke. It was dark. They could barely see. It seemed as if there was no way out. Then there came a voice. Clear, calm, saying he had found the stairs. They didn't know his name. They didn't know where he came from, but they knew their lives had been saved by the man in the red bandana.
Crowther had, without apparent fear or panic, succeeded in getting at least 2 groups of survivors down the stairs to safety. It was clear that he and the firefighters he was with were on their way back up the tower with better equipment to help those caught under heavy debris when they were all crushed. By 2006, Wells' parents, Jeff and Allison Crowther, had met 2 of the dozen or so people Wells had saved. Soon, they became aware of Tanya's story about how she was similarly helped to the stairs by this extraordinary young man. The Crowthers wanted to meet her. Tanya only agreed after she was assured it would be a private event. She explained that she had had some bad experiences with families who were angry that she had survived and their loved ones hadn't. With those assurances, she relented. Over dinner, she explained to them how the man had helped her go down a few floors, then told her she was going to be okay. He said to her, quote, "I have to go back up and help other people," end quote. In footage that appears in the documentary, The Woman Who Wasn't There, Tanya told the story to the world.
My bag was on fire in my arm, and I was smelling my own skin burning. I remember Wells Crowther, the man with the red bandana. He had some type of cloth, and I felt him use that to put the flames out. And he hugged me, and he said, just stay awake, help is coming.
The Crowthers asked if she would speak at that year's memorial concert for their son in their hometown of Upper Nyack, New York. Tanya, somewhat reluctantly, agreed. She asked Linda to come with her that day and, visibly shaken by the thought of telling her story again, pressed the duties onto Linda, who read an extensive version of what happened that day. Linda read how Tanya still carried, quote, the burden of being alive when so many other lives were taken from us, including that of my husband Dave. I am still here and still trying to find a purpose for being here, end quote. Linda continued, explaining how Tanya's family, as a holiday tradition, always wanted her to tell the story of the heroic young man. Quote, I like to tell them that on the day the buildings burned down, Wells stood up to the heavens, end quote. She said by retelling the story, he will remain forever alive, that was her job from here on in. Here's Allison Crowther.
It was all part of this beautiful service that was filled with love and hope, and we were so moved, really moved.
Linda knew Tanya had been really nervous that day, but she wondered why Tanya had made her give the speech. A little while later, Tanya also made her tell the Tribute Center people that Tanya would not, as she had repeatedly promised, donate the bloodied and burned Armani jacket she had worn that day. Tanya said it would just be too triggering every time she came to volunteer, to tell her story. Meanwhile, the politics inside the Survivors Network were getting very complicated. It seemed that Tanya wanted to direct the group's every action, and any board member who questioned or challenged her found themselves suddenly without any avenue to voice their opinions. She was the one, she reminded them, who had spent the last 5 years exclusively devoted to this cause. 5 years working for the network, for Dave's foundation, for the Widows Group. And then, on March 21st, 2007, she was scheduled to attend a Senate committee on the health effects suffered by those who had been exposed to God knows what that September morning. Her 9-page testimony was not given live, but read into the record in what she said was her first shot at getting congressional funding for survivors' medical care. She reported back to the network that she had spent the entire day on Capitol Hill speaking to the most influential people on this most important issue. She was best when she was doing good. But she could be quite coy at times, especially when she talked with those who had family members who died that day.
I just don't want to put those images into their heads. They don't have to know. They don't have to know how their loved ones died. I think it's better if they just don't know. Because I saw so much suffering on that floor to the degree where it's just something that I don't want to share with anyone. I'm just kind of been keeping it to myself. It's a secret that you carry with you.
That explained a phone call she made to Linda one night, saying she was having a breakdown. Merrill Lynch had wanted all of their coworkers to share their experiences. This was to be a nice event to take place at the St. Regis Hotel in New York. A near hysterical Tanya told Linda how it had all gone so horribly, with people yelling at her for not sharing everything she knew. Linda rushed to the hotel and calmed Tanya on the steps outside. Linda decided she would go talk to the people at the St. Regis about how her friend had been treated. They had no idea what Linda was talking about. Tanya told Linda she was having flashbacks. By now, Tanya was regularly consulting with professionals to handle her grief. She told Linda she was thinking about stepping back from the limelight for her own good. It was no surprise to Linda when Tanya visibly freaked out when the New York Times' Dave Dunlap reached out to profile her. You'll remember Dunlap had helped publicize the cause of saving the survivor stairs. It wasn't a surprise he would want to write a profile. The 6th anniversary of the attack was approaching. Dunlap called to talk to Tanya. He also did what reporters do when writing a profile. He called her friends to hear others' perspectives on who she was and how she worked. But Dunlap was met with a concrete wall of suspicion from Tanya. She told her friends he was invading her privacy, asking all these questions she didn't want to answer. She assumed he had some kind of vendetta. It was harassment, she said, plain and simple. She loudly wondered why he was doing this. She told her friends she didn't have to tell him Dave's last name. She didn't have to explain about their marriage. She didn't have to tell him how to get in touch with her in-laws. She didn't have to tell him where she went to school. She didn't have to explain what she did at Merrill Lynch. Jesus, he wanted to know where she'd been treated for her injuries and how long she'd been hospitalized. Here's Janice Salento, a trauma therapist who was on the network's board of directors and a woman who Tanya considered to be her New York mom.
She called me and said, he's asking me these questions, and why is he asking me all these questions? And I said, well, you don't have to answer them. It's okay.
Her reaction concerned her best friends. Janice called Dunlap and told him Tanya didn't want to talk. Dunlap explained that this was just a routine story. He told Janice that Tanya had set up 3 interviews and canceled each at the last minute. Dunlap didn't understand the problem, and she had told her story 1,000 times at Ground Zero to other reporters, and this was just background stuff. A word here for those who ever have the opportunity to talk to a reporter: a reaction, such as the one from Tanya, will only serve to heighten the desire to get answers. If you're evasive, the things you don't want them to know is the very thing they will move heaven and earth to uncover. Anyway, Tanya's friends wanted to shield her. What could they do? She even sent Janice to Dunlap's New York Times office to ask him to refrain from this badgering. By this time, Dunlap had already been doing a lot of reporting. Maybe it was time Tanya talked to a lawyer. On September 21st, 2007, Tanya asked Janice to accompany her to her lawyer's office. Tanya also brought along her mother, a woman Janice had never met. In the elevator on the way up to the lawyer's office, Tanya confided to Janice that she wasn't a U.S. citizen. That was the reason she was concerned about the newspaper story. She could lose her job, be forced to leave the country. Janice told Tanya nobody cared about that. Janice was not invited to go in as Tanya and her mother consulted with Stephanie Fergang-Adwar, their attorney. 2 hours later, Janice was invited into the lawyer's office to talk. Tanya asked Janice if she was mad at her. Janice was confused. "Why would I be mad at you?" she asked. What happened next? Well, this is from Guglielmo's book. Quote, "Adwar seemed to be in a hurry and remained standing while she spoke. You know, Tanya, that it's okay you didn't really work in the World Trade Center, but had only been visiting when the terrorist attack happened, right?" the lawyer asked. "And you know that no one will hold it against you that you only knew Dave for a couple of months and weren't married to him, right? And no one is going to hold it against you that you embellished a few things here and there. You know that, Tanya, right? Everyone tells a white lie now and then." End quote. Janice suddenly doubted everything Tanya had ever said. She went home and called Linda. A heartbroken and horrified Linda told others. Some reacted with incredulity. Others waited to hear more from Tanya. Some had suspected something was off for a long time. At some point that week, Tanya told Janice that her relationship with Dave had been a fantasy. The Times informed Tanya the story of her deception would run on September 27th, 2007. The day before it was published, Tanya wrote an email to the survivors group telling them not to pay attention to the story. She pleaded innocence. The Times story, it was headlined, "In a 9/11 survival tale, the pieces just don't fit," revealed that Merrill Lynch had never employed Tanya, that Harvard and Stanford had no record of her attending their schools, as she had claimed, that Dave's family had never heard of her, nor did they think he had ever been to Hawaii.
We end tonight with a story that began on 9/11, a story of tragedy and heroism, survival and love. There's just one problem. As Jeff Glor reports, this story, repeated many times in the past 6 years, may be a complete fabrication.
That innocence Tanya had pleaded, well, it had been imaginary, as had her whole identity. Later, it was found that Tanya's real name was Alicia Esteva Head. She had not been in the South Tower on September 11th. She hadn't even been in the United States that day. She had been in graduate school in Barcelona and graduated a few months later. She had no assistant named Christine, whom she had so graphically said had been beheaded that day. There had been no widow to be gifted with her dead husband's wedding ring. She was a fraud of the worst kind. But, and maybe this matters, she had not profited financially from any of it. She had, in fact, given money to the Survivors Network as well as thousands of hours without pay to their cause. So, she was never charged with a crime. But she was guilty of something akin to stolen valor. She had pretended to be in pain so that others would care. Call it stolen relevance. Alicia Esteva was raised in Barcelona, the privileged daughter of a wealthy businessman. She grew up with polo ponies and regular tennis dates, but was, some childhood friends would remember, the victim of some bullying about her weight. Her arm injury, well, that was real. When she was 18, she went with friends on a drive along the Valencia coast. The driver of the car hit a wall and the car rolled several times. Alicia's right arm had been severed and thrown out of the car. When she was found, she was cradling her own arm in her lap. She underwent repeated surgeries to reattach it and achieve some level of use. Her father and brother were, shortly thereafter, convicted of embezzlement and sent to prison. Her parents' marriage dissolved. Maybe it was easy to see how a pretend life appealed more to the one she was now living. In any case, she graduated with a master's degree in May 2002 and told people she was going to start anew in America. She loved America. She figured New York was the best of it. Most now believe she spent a lot of her time here studying up on what happened that awful day inside the two iconic landmarks when they were struck and when they fell. The real survivors were left to ask themselves why they had not asked more questions, especially when they had suspicions that something was not quite right with her story.
I did notice that her arm looked like it had been, I don't know, it almost looked like skin grafts on her right arm. And I remember thinking that it didn't look like it had been burned.
I had felt mad at myself for even thinking that there was something amiss. But I often wonder why I was even asking the question.
Aaliyah Zdeno, a Port Authority financial analyst and a tax survivor, would wonder why she never saw the dog Elvis when she visited Tanya at her apartment. The dog always seemed to be on a walk with someone named Lupe. The survivors would also wonder, as would a lot of us, how journalists could write about her and put her on the air, and how politicians had embraced her without someone doing a little bit of fact-checking. I mean, that is the job of a journalist. But for 6 years, in a city full of reporters and a story that had been covered more than any other, no one had done it. The institutional failure was complete. Journalists had failed to do their jobs. The survivors, already abandoned by the memorial planning process, had needed a fraud to get recognition. That was the real crime of the century. Later, it was supposed that no one wanted to inflict more pain on those who had suffered so much, that asking would be crossing that line into some kind of disbelief or disrespect. Tanya had been active and visible in the post-9/11 discussion in perhaps the most media-savvy city on the planet, and no one had ever called Merrill Lynch to check to see if she had worked there. It was all made up. There was no house in the Hamptons. There was no evidence that she had been burned. There was no dog named Elvis. After this realization, a lot of people had questions. But Tanya, or Alicia, well, she had disappeared. Now, it should be said that she had done a lot of good. Robin Gabby Fisher, who co-wrote The Woman Who Wasn't There with Guglielmo, told NPR that
survivors continue to say that a great deal of their healing came from Tanya helping them and from Tanya helping get them recognized. They needed that validation, and no one was able to get that for them except for Tanya.
In the years that followed, Tanya would not be the only pretender to the ghastly experience that unfolded that day. In a 2009 interview, comedian Steve Rannazzisi told Mark Maron in his WTF podcast that he was on the 54th floor of the North Tower when the first plane hit. He said he decided to evacuate, even though the public address announcer said to stay put. He told the story more than once, adding that his wife could have also perished that day, but she was late getting to work. The New York Times found out the truth in 2015. Rannazzisi apologized. Jordan Lifflinder wore an FDNY uniform at the 10th anniversary ceremony. He said he was a captain of Ladder 133 that day. He told the crowd that he had been to 47 funerals in those first few weeks after the attack. He was unmasked a year later. He said he was just, quote, trying to fit in and be one of the guys, end quote. According to the British newspaper The Independent, writing in 2022, quote, while some sought proximity to the attacks for sympathy or attention, others appeared to become so attached to the false narratives that they came to believe their own lies. So common would these deceptions become among the patients of psychiatrist Jean Kim that she came up with a term for it, the 9/11 sign, end quote. Monica Aiken-Murphy was made a widow on September 11th. She knew Tanya and told The Independent that the whole thing didn't make her mad. Instead, it invoked pity. She said, quote, you may think you want to be me, but you don't want to be me, end quote. According to Northwell Health and reported by the New York Times, more than 12.3% of all survivors of that day have post-traumatic stress disorder. Another 675 have anxiety disorders, and 661 others have what can be classified as major depressive disorders. As for the real survivors who worked closely with Tanya Head, they moved on. Janice Salento continued to work closely with the WTC Survivors Network and serve on its board until 2017 when, she told The Times, the group wound down despite many still needing help. Linda Gormley's father, a firefighter, died from cancer related to his work on Ground Zero. Her daughter, Bridget, continues her mother's work helping survivors and first responders who continue to suffer the effects of that day. Bridget also directed the documentary Dust, The Lingering Legacy of 9/11, which deals with the physical illnesses found in those who worked on the site after the attack. Brendan Chellis died of pancreatic cancer in 2022. Alicia Esteva Head is now 52 years old. For years after her exposure, her whereabouts were unknown. In 2021, reporting about her location was contradictory. Spanish newspaper El Mundo reported that she had returned to Barcelona, where she lived with her mother and had recently opened a renovation company. But around the same time, British newspaper The Independent reported finding a LinkedIn profile that seemed to match her biography, claiming she was working at the Asada Business School while living in New York. Asada did not respond to the paper's request for verification. She has never publicly explained what led her to fabricate such an elaborate lie or why she chose to become the false face of one of America's greatest tragedies. She remains hard to pin down. Some say they've spotted her in New York, others say she's back in Barcelona with her family. We were able to find an account on the social media site formerly known as Twitter, but it's private. Of all the lies Alicia, aka Tanya, told, one thing was true. A man named Dave died on the 99th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center that terrible September morning. His name was David Scott Suarez. Just 24 when he died, he'd be remembered as an athlete, an Eagle Scout, and a doer. A 1999 Penn State graduate, he worked for Deloitte Consulting and, while doing a systems audit, was temporarily posted at Marsh & McLennan, housed at the World Trade Center. He was planning on going to graduate school the next year. While living in New York that fall, he volunteered at New York Cares, where he tutored kids readying to take the SAT. There's a story about David that gets often repeated in media accounts. It said that David, a guy who always gave money to those on the street who asked for it, went up to a man in a wheelchair once who was begging. David asked the man what would make him happy. The man replied, $20. David pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to him. The man then got up from the chair, folded it, and walked away. When his friends asked about how he felt about being scammed, David shrugged it off. He said it was better that you give to someone who doesn't need help than to ignore someone who does. He never met Tanya Head, and they never would have had an opportunity to have ever crossed paths. When he was memorialized in the New Jersey town where he grew up, there was nothing to bury. That first plane had hit between the 92nd and 99th floors. David might have been among the first to die. Pieces of him were found 6 months later. While I was working on this episode, I kept wondering what he would have thought of the ruse that invoked him at every turn. I decided that while the rest of us find Tanya's lies to be heinous and unforgivable, he might have had a different reaction. I mean, we can't know, but he may have appreciated that she cried whenever she spoke of him and often visited the on-site memorials so she could touch his name engraved there. I found an interview with David's father from 2006, which ran just weeks before Tanya's unmasking. Ted Suarez said he kept a journal for a while after David's death. He jotted down his musings, big and small, until finally, around 2004, he decided it was time to move on. He told The Times, quote, "If I am to heal, I cannot let hate poison me," end quote. To report and write this episode, journalist Amy Wilson read The Woman Who Wasn't There, The True Story of an Incredible Deception by Robin Gabby Fisher and Angelo J. Guglielmo Jr. She also watched Guglielmo's documentary by the same name. She watched The Man in the Red Bandana, a documentary by Matthew J. Weiss, Joshua Saison, and Chad Verdi. And she reread some of the coverage that the New York Times did of the terrorist attack and its aftermath. The newspaper received 6 Pulitzer Prizes in 2002 for their work. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through GrabBag Collab. Head to www.grabbagcollab.com for exclusive content related to this show and access to other series on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and sometimes my child, Hunt Van Benskoten. Other music comes from Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, please help us out by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts. Also tell your friends. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're @centuriespod. And you can find us on the Crimes of the Centuries Facebook page.